when it doesn't add up, flag that for a question, and then try to zero in on the bigger bit that you do get, and see if that can connect to something else that expands it a little bit more, and maybe gives it some context that makes it easier to understand, makes a little bit more sense, and continue from there. So, while I just mark the class, a couple of people, any immediate questions or concerns, things to concentrate on as I discussed today?
Maybe going over reproductive systems just one more time.
Absolutely. Like the parts of the flowers and the pollination fertilization process.
Leaning a little bit more towards just the pollination and fertilization. Covering the others won't hurt.
Yep. Absolutely. Others?
Yeah,
Anna?
kind of bouncing off that. I have questions about the pollen too. I kind of got stuck on that.
Oh, yeah. I just had another person ask me about that exact one.
Oh, okay, you went.
We'll address that here straight away. We're gonna get in on the homework then, and Andrew?
Emergence of monocot cut seeds.
That's something I wanted to come back to today too, because I know the language can be tricky, and the actual value of knowing the difference is pretty straightforward, and so we just want to keep track of which one is which, and I'll try to make that more clear. For both. Yeah. But again, only through flowers and seeds for Western. So here, working on this, right, there's labeling the parts. I'm hoping that's good practice, because I'll definitely be asking you to know what are the male flower parts, female flower parts, and then to connect that to perfect flower. Monoecious plant. Right, and some of those are perfect and some are not. And then dioecious, so to make sense of that distinction, right? Either male and female parts on the same plant, if it's in the same flower, then we say it's perfect, or on separate plants, how that connects to the pollination needs of that species. That first page, very answerable. Asking you then on the next page to fill in information about each thing. What does it do? That's just directly studying right there. In pollination, I want to make one important point. So I think here the gist of it is, right, pollen from an anther landing on the stigma might be the same flower, that would, right, same flower or same plant. Those would both be self-pollination, or different plant of the same species. But what I want to get to there is that point about the same species. So keep in mind, when we're talking about pollination and fertilization, with some breeding exceptions, generally human precipitated changes, we're talking about two things of the same species that can successfully breed, right? Successfully mix genes and come up with something else. And so that's what we're referring to when we talk about pollination and fertilization. Here, which one was wind versus animal? We had some clear examples of those. So again here, because it was lots of terms, I'm going through with these things like the little chart or short explanation of what those specific structures do as a mechanism for study, for writing down, understanding, and like if you could look at that, without referring to anything, that's really good, right? To feel confident about that. explanation. And you can test yourself, right? You've got this homework now. You can look at a flower and think about it, name those things, and see if it makes sense. Here, and explain the difference between self-pollination and cross-pollination. Again, I just want to keep both the same species concept in mind, and one distinction that self-pollination, we're talking about self, right? We're talking about the whole plant as an individual. So, whether that's a perfect flower on that plant, or separate male and female flowers on that same plant, can both be methods for self-pollination. So that's within the individual, and thus, right, the same genes. And they might not mix exactly the same, right? This isn't necessarily cloning like vegetative propagation, but the available gene pool for mixing is the same. In contrast to cross-pollination, where we're talking about two individuals from that same species. So it might be the case where it's male-only plants and female-only plants, and they cross-pollinate. It might be monoecious plants with male and female separate flowers, and male on one and a female on another, cross-pollinate. It could be within a perfect flower on two different plants, and there's still that genetic mixing then that makes for more adaptation, more robust response to the environment. So self-pollination, cross-pollination, we're talking about at the individual plant level versus multiple plants of that same mix. Here we get to Kayla's question, what stimulates the pollen tree to grow? The first one is the chemical signaling of that pollen landing on the stigma strikes the signal to begin that process, right? Where I outlined it, and I'll revisit those slides here in a bit. Splits into two, one becomes those sac cells, the sperm nuclei, the other becomes food source. And the question was, why do pollen grains only produce tubes and flowers of their own species? Back to this again, and the answer is, it only works chemically when the shapes line up of the pollen on the stigma. And so if it's a different species, the pollen shape, on the microscopic level is different, and so the sort of lock-in key connection isn't quite right, and thus you don't get that opening then that creates space for that pollen to create, make itself all the way down to the ovary. So it's a way to facilitate successful fertilization within the same species, and a way to keep mutation aborted ovary from mixing with other species. Julian?
You mean what, physically or genetically?
I meant more as a metaphor. There is a physical aspect to the shape of the pollen connecting with the stigma, but most of it is chemical signaling then from that pollen once it's connected.
So if I answer that with talking about genetics, like an SP genetic match, it's not really a whole picture, or is that?
No, I think if you have to pick one of those two, genetically is more appropriate, because it's basically a set of chemical signals that only work within the species. And again, there's a small subset of variations where you can breed outside the species, and in those cases, you raise the chance for mutation, you raise the chance for abortion or lack of success, but there are set of exceptions.
For sure.
When I did the homework, one thing I kind of stumbled on that made that make sense to me was that pollen tube grows sort of like a root hair, where it's like directionally downwards, and the pollen grain is being carried down through that tube, so that it's going to help tie everything together for me, because at first I was not getting how that works.
Like that, the down.
Yeah,
You're
it's
saying,
just like in a direction, just like a repair.
yep, it's not random growth at that point. Yeah, the signaling specifically works because those two things are compatible. So we call that, thanks for bringing that up. What's that?
I was just saying out loud, I wrote genetic or biological compatibility.
Yes, yes, compatibility. When it comes to pollination, indicates same species. Here's our generic stigma. Right, our oversized pollen ring. If these are not compatible, right, different species, or there's a chance that some pollen is malformed and then doesn't pollinate correctly, it might only, if I just split and only one is created, and that can create like a set of side problems. But if it's not compatible, this is the end of the story then. That stigma can get crowded with non-compatible pollen. If it is compatible, then right, that downward growth that Christopher is mentioning that creates the pollen tube is chemically signaled to begin. So if it's compatible, then once contact happens, pollen with stigma from the pistil, then we get this development. Incompatible pollen, no further growth. Yeah, so we don't get, in that case, fertilization with incompatibility.
What is the mechanism to bring that pollen down? Is it just gravity or something?
Not just gravity, it's actual chemical signaling that, so Julian, excuse me, was asking about this last week too, with something related, and where the answer is like beyond the scope of, I think, what's relevant to the class, but it's a quick set of chemical signals that then both the cells that were the pollen have split, and now one of them is dividing actively to make this tube. You can imagine, right? There's actually space then for movement inside. At the same time, that same set of signals has told the stigma to allow that to happen. So there's no counter response from the flower, like don't do that. That would indicate maybe incompatibility or some kind of intrusion. So it's just both ways, a set of chemical signals that induce that come about from this event here, which is the pollination. And yeah, and so that's as much detail as I'm going to go to there, because one, that's actually a spot where there's ongoing research that that I haven't read all of, and also because it gets pretty complicated. Yeah, Christopher.
So I guess I got confused on that. So you're saying pollination is the point of the event where the pollen hits the top of the stigma, not when it fertilizes the pollen.
That's right. That's fertilization. Yep. I wanna make a distinction there. This is pollination, and then exactly. So pollen tube forms. Right. Sperm nuclei. Sperm move down here. When it gets into that ovary and fertilizes the ovule, then that is fertilization, which is a separate event. You have to have pollination first to get there, right? But not every pollination event will result in fertilization.
So the pollen grain that comes down, it reaches a nuclei, and then that nuclei like splits, or is it separate pollen grains that come down? One turns into the seed, the other turns into the fruit.
Yep. It's,
The sperm is supposed to be,
say again.
I was saying so you split and make the pollen tube, and then the other one that splits develops into two sperm nuclei.
Yeah, let's look at this. So pollen grains have two cells. When they land, that's pollination, right? One becomes the pollen tube, and the other one then splits into, creates the sperm cells. So, one was the tube, the other was these two that are now cleaved in half. And then those move down. And the first one there fertilizes the ovule. The other gets incorporated into the endosperm/cotyledon as food source. And if there are multiple ovules, then that process happens multiple times, like with our corn example in each kernel. So yeah, a pollen grain is two cells. One of them becomes the tube, the other is going to be the sperm that fertilized the egg, right, the ovule. And then that one splits into, so now you've got both, one to do fertilization and one to become a food source. And that gets at the last bit here. When does fertilization occur? Down here in the ovary at the ovule. It's the site of that, distinct from pollination, which occurs higher up. Okay. On the top of the stigma, in connection with that pollen grain. What part of the flower develops into a seed? And that's the ovule, yes. Not the ovary. That's the whole thing that will then form around it, right? That whole fleshy fruit wall, right? The edible part of the apple, not just the bit inside of it where we see the seeds. So the ovule is the egg, it is the seed. Dormant from chemical signals of not to grow quite yet, so that it can get into a set of conditions that are favorable, and that might be immediately, or that might be down the road, right? We talked about dormancy and how to break that using water or other factors like scarification, temperature, etc., to break that seed coating down the line, hopefully for the plant, at a time when competition's low, resources are appropriate, that means there's moisture, there's not, there's appropriate temperature, you know, and it can get risky. Plants can be fooled. So generally it's not like one drop of water and dormancy is broken, or one day at 50 degrees and that seed tries to germinate, right? It's an accumulation of signals like that. Otherwise, you know, even today, upper 40s, some things want to germinate, but ongoing signals of cool temperature, right, is going to slow that down. So it can happen that abnormally high temperatures for an extended period, you know, if we had, like back in April, we had some very warm temperatures and dry days in the middle of April, where some things then were waking up, right? Seeds germinating, trees leafing out, and yet a month later we were back into the 40s, and it might spell trouble then for things that are more sensitive to have responded in that way. So they have built in some strategies to deal with risk by having to accumulate those signals, but it still can happen that it actually, you know, you do get a prolonged warm period or prolonged wet period, and then things change. Yeah.
Tanya in the orchard had mentioned we're having problems with the warming trends, and so like prunus and stuff, they're setting blossoms based on signals, and then it's too early and they catch a cold snap and then they drop all their blossoms. So it's causing a lot of problems with setting fruit. So
Yeah, exactly.
The blossom, not only do the seeds have that ability to interpret a signal, environmental signal, but so do the flowers.
That's right. And it's definitely becoming a risk in fruit all around the world as temperatures change early season. There's flushes of flowers now that we used to see in late April that are happening in late March, and then you have to just hope that hard frost doesn't occur, because it'll then make all those flowers drop, and then those things can't get pollinated, fertilized, and become fruit if they've fallen off the plant. Right? So it's definitely a risk. What can you do there? Yeah, so that'll,
Or freezing or dropping below a specific temperature.
Mhm.
Not from-
so that's a response to when that temperature is present, how you keep the plant from having to deal with the results, right, by making it a little bit warmer around. But I'm talking about ways to actually deal, time-wise with that, what's now early flowering because of that signaling. Like, is there a way we can fool the plants sort of into not doing that and doing what they were originally supposed to do? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you remove them?
Can remove the flowers.
Reconcentrate the energy kind of thing?
But there's still only a relatively short flowering period, and if you remove too many, you don't get more in that period, right? Then you're costing your yield at the same time. So there's some of that inevitably happens and can work, but not exclusively. Other ideas, Caleb?
Does it have to do with pruning? Like, do you take off certain branches of the same idea, but without removing the flowers?
That's one option. Yep, you can prune in, to direct it toward the, say, the north side of the plant, north side of the tree, where there's less sunlight, so it's gonna take longer to accumulate, the signaling to create those flowers. That's one. Claire?
Pruning later or doing a double prune?
So talk about the pruning later, I think makes sense.
Pruning
right?
later to delay bud break,
Mhm.
or a double prune where you're pruning, I don't know, this is just grapevines, but you first prune when you have a hard, when like it's hard freeze, and then you delay that second prune where you refine and clean up as long as possible to have a much later bud break.
In some of those some cases, you're even, you may have to be removing buds that are opening in that second prune. Yep, so that's another one. If you have the, oh, Andrew, go ahead.
I was gonna say, just covering your farm practice, like covering certain crops with like cover of some kind to either slow down.
Yeah.
Or help protect from the environment at that point, just covering it.
Sure. Again, that's kind of like, where Zach was going. You can protect it from the temperature, and that definitely happens. Commercial orchards, for example, have blast heaters, big propane operated heaters that are literally blasting on a night where it's gonna be right around freezing to keep it just above. Another one, if you can plan, maybe if you're thinking about your orchard now and you recognize this risk with less reliable temperature throughout the season, is to plant in areas that might take a little bit longer to develop. Oftentimes we're focused on pushing things as early as you can get, put it in that south-facing sun, right? Put it on that south-facing slope, so it's getting as much sun as possible. You may want to conceal those sensitive flowers on that fruit tree a little bit out of the direct south sun, so that it develops slightly more slowly, and it might come more like in its traditional average development time, instead of on the early side when we get those high temperatures, in March or April. So, north side of a hill, in a slightly shaded area, which again might not be ideal, but you have to sort of judge how does that help you, in a place where sometimes slowing it down is actually an advantage for those things, because we depend on perennial flower development for fruit each season. So you're kind of hedging your bet over time by moving into the spot that isn't direct sun all the time early spring and slowing it down a little bit. Does that make sense? Some?
So my practical, takeaway from what you're saying is that just be aware that the plants are signaling, to behave certain ways from the environment with seed or flower, and then that way you can control what the plant is doing and get it to behave the way you want it to.
Yep.
So if you're putting seeds in your humidity chamber, just drop them, things like that.
Definitely. And yeah, using that knowledge of conditions is a good way to protect yourself, protect the plant, and space things out. Like another example we like to use sometimes on the farm is we will direct seed something the same day that we put in transplants, 4 or 5 week old transplant of that same crop. So that then we've spaced out the development, given ourselves, 2 harvests, and then within a single day's project. So you're getting the same thing. If it so happens early season that you get that hard frost right away, then you might damage some of the transplants, but that direct seeded crop is either hasn't germinated yet or is developing in the colder temperatures and is going to be a little bit more hardy. So you're both hedging your bet, and if they both are successful, then you're also increasing your supply. Talked about seed dispersal. Some examples. You can tell me how this thing was a strategy. What does it use? Falling, right, with wings, water, hooks, etc. That's pretty straightforward. Labeling your seed. Why is it important for water to enter the seed? Definitely understand that one. I think that's our number one seed dormancy breaking factor is water. And then this, I also ended the seed presentation with on Wednesday, and we talked about how there's 2 notable things happening here. Cotyledon food source is being consumed as the graph dips, right? Being consumed to push out new leaf, to make the radicle grow, get that first root out and absorbing water, and eventually, at the presence of true leaves, that's not cotyledons, that's actual photosynthetic leaves then, as they start to photosynthesize and save carbohydrates, then we see more growth and the curve go back up. Yeah.
Does that imply cotyledons aren't photosynthesizing?
Some have a little bit of photosynthetic capacity, but on a whole, they're not very helpful, and they're mostly just an existing food source. And so you'll see, like those beans, for example, that we cut open, you grow that seedling bean, you'll see those cotyledons literally wither. They'll start to get wrinkly, they look like they're drying out, even though the rest of the plant is continuing to grow healthy and green as they're just consumed from the inside. So yeah, they're not in fact leaves, even though cotyledon, the Greek is seed leaves, but it's just an internal food source, and they don't have like the palisade mesophyll, spongy mesophyll, in the way that we talked about. Here's how the leaf is laid out, and here's the roles of that thing inside.
I know a lot of them are reflecting green light.
Still reflecting green
So
light,
it's like that.
that's right. So absorbing all those other colors, but it doesn't mean that it's putting it to the best photosynthetic use. The same as, we see stems of a lot of plants as green, and yet they're, besides the cacti, they're also not doing much photosynthesis. So quick look at that. What else?
Can we go over visual versus visual?
Yes, that was another request. Do that. Go to So, the primary thing to keep in mind here, epigeel means above. Like epidermis is like on the top, on the outside of our skin, or on the outside of plant cells, right? On the outside of plant tissue. And hypo means under. So plants that have epigeal germination, the cotyledons, like that being, they end up above the surface, right? So we can see them above the ground, and the seedling plant grows from there. Hypogeel plants, the cotyledon stays underneath the ground, and the plant grows from there. So apical and hypocotyl push both directions, and here they do the same thing, still pushing, but from a spot above the surface. So that's to the point that I was making about that early risk. By keeping your food source below ground, might be a little bit safer. If something gets eaten above, those cotyledons up here get chowed, then that's all you had. And it might be challenging then to hear this bean on the top in A, right, to make more. Whereas here, if your food source is down below, but your little pea leaves get eaten, there's still the opportunity to maybe push a little bit more growth and get some true leaves before you run out of energy. So, different strategy wise, we notice that, especially the monocots grasses tend to do hypo below the ground. But that's really about the location of the cotyledons in early development. So,
The dicots, they don't strictly have, hypo.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so these are both dicots, but one has each, yeah. Does that help a little bit? Yeah, so if you think about it as where is the cotyledon at that time? Right? And of course, it takes a minute, right? So terminated, and then in the epigeel, or epigynous, same, flip up, but still. Cotyledons, epicotyl, everything above the surface except the root. Right? And then here, cotyledon remains below the surface. That's the primary difference. What else? Temperature, its impact on germination. Talk about breaking dormancy. Definitely understand this. Right? The vision, of course, was that taking on of water. And understand this. Back to roots. And here, meristem of the root, dividing cells. Right? First making more cells to grow, then those cells elongating, eventually getting assigned a job, making your root hairs. And your role is going to be water absorption. And go from there. Essential, once that seed coat's broken, start getting water first thing, and then start making leaves. Developing food through photosynthesis. Other questions?
On the study guide, I was just a little bit confused about the wording of this question of like the different types of leaf modifications. What exactly are you asking for?
In leaves. Describe three leaf modifications. What is the purpose of each? So, did you have any ideas, Catherine? One leaf modification?
Well, I was thinking about like, cacti or like having needles versus, like a broadleaf, but I just wasn't sure exactly what you were.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one, leaf mods. One could be spines. Like cacti. Just, absolutely. And so, what's the point of that modification?
To save water.
Water retention. That's right. What else? What else do spines do? Protection. Protection. What are they protecting, guys? With the connected to this one. Other parts of the plant, the part that's doing photosynthesis, right? And that's storing water. So all the essentials there. You know, food storage, water storage in those big, right, cactus platyphils or, barrels, depending on the species. So yeah, protecting the resources. At the same time, reducing water loss in an extreme environment of high temperature, low humidity. So that's one. Other leaf mods, yeah. this were recessed back a layer here, right, then you've got that little pocket that was described of increased humidity. So, water-wise, that's a benefit. This one have a lot of benefits, really useful. Good to understand everything that they're doing. Cool. How they open and close, the mechanism of swelling with water. To push vacuoles of those guard cells, turgid, to open, or slump shut, to close. And again, that's happening in millions of instances in some percentage, right? Either there's more open than closed, or there's more closed than open, and that says we're trying to hold on to water, we're trying to get CO2 in, there's some response to the environment based on how many are open or closed at a given time. So reduce that water loss. Exchange gases. This was on the quiz, right? Most are on the underside of the leaf, and that is a out of direct sunlight adaptation. There's lots of them. They're controlled by the guard cells and turgor pressure, like we just mentioned. Maybe stuck. Another leaf adaptation. Not just trichomes. That's right. Those are just another word for leaf hairs. As you correctly guess, save water. Important function. Those guys. What else do they do?
Are some trichomes sticky?
Say what?
Are some trichomes sticky?
Some are sticky.
Yeah, check. Sex attacking them maybe?
Cool the planet. Cool the planet.
How so?
Retaining the water on top of the plant in the leaf, or in the hairs on the leaf.
Yeah, along with, right, keeping it more moist, sometimes that can be a cooling tactic. Likewise, they're reflective, right? So reflecting back some light in a highlight situation will also be cooling. Cool. Reflect. Yeah. So that's what that question's getting at. Those are not the only three answers, but, you know, just like in the homework question about saving water, it's a lot of the same material. Yeah.
So with the spines, would that be the same basically as the needles on like angiosperm? As far as like reduced surface area as a strategy, so that if you list like spines and then you listed that, it would just not be what you're looking for.
Well, if your answer for both was, you know, the exact same, they save water, reduce surface area, then, yeah, I'm looking for more. But, you know, we'll see. So you said angiosperm, but I want to be clear that many needle leaf trees or plants are gymnosperms, right? Those cedars outside, you know, pines, firs, etc., with what we call needles, are all gymnosperms. And again, that gets to our discussion in that difference in like vessels moving a lot of water, trachea's moving some all the time, kind of a slow but sure tortoise in the hare situation. And the needles contribute to that. Right? They can continue to photosynthesize under low light conditions better than some big leaf. At the same time, they're losing less water, so they're functional, you know, year round, albeit at a slower clip. It's a strategy for slow, reliable growth over a big flush. Patrick,
So for how you're talking about, like you would want more, so in this particular situation, if you were to list spines, but another one would be thick modified leaves, like the aloe, that would be all right? Because it's storing water elsewhere or in a different way.
yeah, so saying, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so it's sort of the opposite of that, right?
That's what I was thinking also.
Spines are a reduced leaf,
Yeah.
and the aloe water storage feature is like, right, it's calling on the leaf to do more.
Right.
Right? Yeah, this would be another way to answer that question. Shade and sun leaves. Again, they have differences. Double layer of palisade leaves grow in the sun for that more photosynthesis, right, and more chloroplasts. Tend to be bigger. So yeah, again, with all of those, if you can correctly identify the features that say what that purpose is, right, or conversely, there might be a risk with that. Of course, all stomata carry the risk of losing water, carry the risk of some type of infection, and thus the ability to close them matters. But if you can correctly describe the thing, then you're not losing points most of the time. Just try not to repeat yourself each time. Others there about leaves? Let's finish it off. We talked about these things already, these three adaptations. We talked about some specialized scenarios. We talked about brackets. This floral leaves that kind of have the role of flower petals. Take a look at the review. Flowers and fruits. The first one asks you the three main types of fruit. Describe each one. This is just what we were talking about on Wednesday. That was right around here. There's the relationship between what two things? The number of flowers and the number of ovaries. That's right. So, for example, simple fruit. One flower and one ovary. And there was two other categories that I gave. One and then
Accurate.
So what's different in the case of the aggregate fruits?
It's like a small bunch, right?
One flower, multiple ovaries.
One flower and multiple ovaries, potentially. Yeah. So we talked about the raspberry example, like Brian's saying, this little bunch. In that case, it could be, several dozen ovaries from that one flower. And in the case of multiple, then it's both many and many. Of course, don't forget, outside of all of those, we had the carpet examples, and maple orange, right? No pollination, no fertilization, still get a fruit.
Would that count as an answer for one of the three types of fruits, or would you be looking for the first edition?
I would accept it. It's still a fruit. It's outside of the, right? I mean, banana has a flower. You just don't need to pollinate that flower or fertilize that ovary to get it. So yeah, if that were the question, and you said a simple aggregate and carpet, then I would think you knew what you were talking about. And again, if there was a second part to the question, then you were called to say, right, no pollination here or fertilization. You have to make that distinction so that I know you know. And back on the side. You can see here labeled important in how things go in and out. We talked about that, especially for getting water into the roots and for the functioning of guard cells and stomata. What's active transport? Where does it come from? We didn't focus on the ATP part of that question, the energy source. That's going to come up in photosynthesis. So for now, if you know what active transport is, you know what a carrier protein is, you know what facilitated diffusion and osmosis are, that's going to be the extent of that first section. What type of roots provide the best anchoring? That number 7 there. Taproots, that's right. And be able to compare the primary root systems, tap versus the other one, which is fibrous root system, for their functionality. We saw it in the homework, right? There's not an obvious, like, one is just always better, but it fits the environment and it has specific positives and negatives. So understand that and how they might be used. Thinking about that over the weekend, had a lot of windy weather and significant amount of rain in a short time. A little bit of each. Okay? So maybe that fibrous root system can initially absorb lots of that water, but after 2.5 inches of rain in the last 3 days, that's going to be more, than available in that top 6 or 8 inches of the soil profile. So now Taproot's got an advantage after the fact. It's moving through and it can still capture it, and Taproot is going to hold in the wind better. Generally, there's a size distribution there where things with fibrous root system aren't also 15 feet tall, but in some cases they are. And those are going to be the things that are the first to lodge, right? The first to fall over. Under high wind, under flooding, extreme water, or some other environmental circumstance. What's meristematic tissue? Definitely understand the importance of that and where we find it, not just in roots. Stems here, right? Your focus is on nodes. Your focus is on the inside of a stem, what it looks like, especially in secondary growth, woody growth of trees. Yeah.
Going back to the roots, what is that apoplastic pathway?
Anybody? That was a hard word. Yeah.
I don't remember hearing that one.
Anybody remember that one?
That's like where water can enter into the root. And that has to do with like the Casparian strip. Like a free movement of water into the root by osmosis.
Yeah.
Up until the Casparian Strip.
Yeah, because the Casparian strip is
Say that louder, Sal, that's right.
For water moves in between the cells rather than through the cells.
It's that one step. Yep. So, apo means a outside of or not, right? Not technically inside the cell. This is the pinkest cell membrane here, so this is between the cell wall and the cell membrane. And that's where some water can just move in that space, but then at that Casparian strip, right, forced inside. So now it's in the symplast, in the life function part of the cell. For what reason?
Because then it has to decipher if the gradient is correct and then we let it pass, right?
So the gradient is here, beyond all of this, in
Okay.
the getting in from the outside environment into the root hair.
Is it like just to continue the supply chain?
It's to keep it lined up so that it can have that supply waiting and make sure there's no breaks as you get stacked water molecules into the xylem. That's it. So, I won't be saying something like, explain to me the apoplastic pathway as a test question. But I might ask you what we just said, why does it have to come inside the cell right here? And journey of water from the outside into the root, through the root, into the vascular tissue. That's kind of where we left it with the quiz that included roots. But now we know more. Right? It goes through the stems, it goes into the leaves, and eventually it goes out of the leaves via transpiration. And where does it actually, so that's the process of pulling it out. And the stomata, right, is actually the site where water is lost. Yeah. So if you can trace something like that, if you can trace that story of water, you're gonna be able to answer several questions effectively. If you can trace the story of pollination and fertilization, you're gonna be able to answer several questions effectively. For example, you can look at something this and tell me about self-pollination or cross-pollination. If you can tell me the next set of steps, if you can describe this, then you're going to know all the things that I can ask about pollination and fertilization. So it starts with the short understanding of things, that like the Cliff's Notes on each slide, and then as you put together, right, it becomes a story of how the water moves through the plant, say. And if you can tell that story, then you can pick out one instance. Maybe I don't ask you, like, tell me the whole story start to finish, but we want to talk about, you know, what we just said. Why does water have to go in to get around the Casparian strip, right? If you understand and can extract that piece of the story, right, then you can both correctly answer that question, and you can extrapolate that understanding into other questions too. So I think that as you study, telling yourself those little stories in a way that information connects rather than just raw facts sets you up for having it all make sense in a way where you understand it, and then you can answer, you know, whatever about it from there.
Going back to mycorrhizae, would it be accurate to explain that as in exchange for foods from the plant, they help collect water, and then specifically, I mean, nutrients in general, but specifically phosphorus?
Yeah, if we're going to talk about mycorrhizae, let's be specific enough to say phosphorus, and then likewise what the fungus gets, right? Carbohydrates, sugars, bigger molecules that it can't put together itself. And I think that's good, right? So we talked about the rhizobia giving the plant nitrogen, or the mycorrhizae giving the plant phosphorus, and then both getting those more complex carbohydrates from the plant that is good at synthesizing those things and making them available. Good.
Is there a name for the plants pollinating different species of plants, so I don't get confused in my brain and call that cross-pollination?
Mostly those things are named by what they create, and
So it would just be cross-pollination, but with the specific, in this case, whatever, it would be to another species, but in most cases it's not.
yeah, so let's
Like tomato,
let's keep those exceptions for the sake of talking about this in the test or in this class out of there, because they're
I was just trying to categorize it in my brain so I could not think that cross-pollination means different species, because the first one means.
yes. So yeah, there's not a clear other term, but see if you can keep it to self is with one plant and cross is with two. In both cases, from the same species. Here. Stems. There's a lot of questions related to stems here.
stuff, pretty much just that constant rate, whereas like angiosperm goes through more of a cycle where they're like going to vessels, tracheas, and all that secondary growth, where there's not as much room, or as much resources to try and put towards height. It's more about
Yeah. Correct. Talking about this. Yes, so part of it is exactly what Julian is saying. This is a bigger risk, basically, that vessel production, right? So you can move a lot of water because you need to make leaves every season, but there's a big risk there that you might also move a lot of air, and then right, when that tube is filled with air, now you can't move any water there. So that embolism, right, or that cavitation prevents the outward pull. So that's a risk for right, those deciduous angiosperms. On the other hand, this constant smaller size means, I think we drew this out. Smaller size means easier to fill the tube, right? Less chance for embolism, and you can have a little bit of force to pull something further. Again, here's a vessel, here's trachea. When this fills the tube, and again, there's a connection point between water molecules, that cohesion, and then adhesion to the sides of the tube, pulling up, 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 you can get farther with a narrower tube. It takes more effort, more energy, and higher risk to pull that size droplet every time. And that's nuts, right? I mean, obviously there's deciduous trees that are tall, but not as tall as that coast redwood that's 300 feet tall. Okay? And that's because of narrow tube, less embolism, easier to pull that narrow straw.
I have a question about softwood versus hardwood. Looking at this, it seems like softwood gymnosperms are going to be a denser, heavier wood. But that's not the case. What is that?
Yeah. Good question. It doesn't, right? Logically, it seems like that should add up. Because these things are all close together. Anybody?
There are deciduous species that are considered softwood as well.
There are.
So it must be just maybe a characteristic of the actual plant, not as much due to its like, whether it's a gymnosperm or angiosperm.
There's variability among species, even in either group. But generally, we can say that the gymnosperms tend to be softwoods, and the hardwoods that exist are generally angiosperms. So there's definitely a trend there, and the reasoning being that tracheids, vessel elements, and fibers, right, combine in the angiosperm trees to create the hardwood, and it's those fibers in between them. We didn't spend a lot of time on that, that actually like glues them into what dries as a harder thing. And the tracheids alone don't have fibers, so they end up being soft. And so it's the fibers that come along with having vessels back here that make it harder when it dries. So it does seem counterintuitive, but it's because of that structure that comes with the vessels, this additional thing, the fibers. Yeah.
talk more about fibers. I don't remember much from.
Yeah. This is one where I talked with Jim, our agriculture instructor, and that seemed like he wanted to. Have you guys addressed that in R1, the fibers? Or maybe it was, maybe. But anyway, it seemed like something that you wanted to cover there, specifically for agriculture. And so the fibers are made out of primarily cellulose, which is like cell wall material, so it's hard. And then it tends to be stuck in between these things. And so as they dry out, it forms like more of a skeletal structure holding them all together. Whereas here, with nothing else in between, as you cut into it, they peel apart very easily because there's not this sort of dried glue, like adhesive, that's interconnecting them all. So as far as chemical structure, that's as much as I'll say.
So it's basically a glue while the tree is alive and just a dense material once it's dead.
It's like instead of just having two things next to each other, there's a layer in between that sticks them together. And so then to pull that apart, you need more force. Like for to burn that, you need higher temperature and thus get more energy out of it when you do it. What else? Covered quite a bit, and we don't have to be here the whole time if all your questions are answered. We were just talking about 25, or connected to that, would a monocot or dicot tree be better able to withstand high winds? So they're getting you at the root system, what you know about those root systems. And so we talked about taproot versus not, right? But what about the stems? Take the roots out of it for a moment and answer number 25. Monocot or dicot better able to withstand high winds? Sure.
A monocot is going to be more flexible because it doesn't have the, what it was really.
Yeah, the secondary growth, right? Yes, that secondary xylem or wood. Yep. So instead of that dead, dry stuff in the middle all the time, that tends to snap. We get palm tree that's still just primary growth in waves in the wind. Prakash, you had an answer?
I was gonna ask about drawing for the midterm, just in general, is it going to be a lot of drawing, should we prepare for?
Some, but I wouldn't classify it as a lot.
Okay.
There are some drawings given that I'll ask you to label. There's a couple that I'll ask you to draw, and so yeah, probably 3 questions with some drawing.
Okay.
Other form questions like that, like what you'll see or what you expect, Andrew?
Is it like double dip, like a quiz, or?
It is. Quiz. Last quiz was 3 pages. I'd say it's probably slightly more than double. But with more true and false and multiple choice questions. So time-wise, I would expect that it would take twice as long.
Is it all in class or is there a team part?
All in class.
My question was gonna be, is it like mostly written?
It's like what you've seen, but with more true and false, more multiple choice, then a short answer section, labeling section, bonus points, opportunities. So, yeah, I'd say right in line with what I've already given you, but more of each thing.
We covered in 20 and 24, the let's say,
Number 20, 20 and 24.
That's the one I was looking at.
All right, so 20, what is a bud scale scar? I think we were talking about this on Wednesday also. So, let's make sure we got it.
Isn't that the location of the?
It's, he said drawing.
Yes. Yeah. Question was, is it the previous location of the apical bud?
Oh.
Yes. was at some point they were. Yep, so last year, what we see now as bud scale scar here, right, was that thing from a year ago, right? So now, this bud scale, literally the scale that's surrounding that bud, as it falls off, it's gonna leave, right, that mark. So it's the actual sign of where that terminal bud was previously. And similarly, right, the leaf scar is the sign of where that leaf fell off the branch. I have a related question here in 24. Where's the leaf scale scar or leaf scar located? And is the bud above or below the scar? So, let's, how many, here's a note. Where is that leaf scar? Below the note. And is the bud above or below? Okay, we got smiley face leaf scar with bud above. So we can see the vascular bundles, right? And that smiley. And if we're correctly oriented, right, then it's that and not that. Not this. KW question? No? 26, the tissue that creates annual rings. Secondary xylem. Yep.
I think you answered this, but, so what exactly, what sections are gonna be on the midterm? It's just up until flowers, or?
That's right. Yep, and the rest of those will be on the final exam. And of course, so now you've got the homeworks, 2 quizzes, right, to look at. You can think that because the flower material wasn't on either of the quizzes, I'm gonna ask you more. This is my opportunity to ask you more about that. So I'm likely to concentrate there. But also pull things together that include your understanding from earlier. I talked about the journey of water, talked about pollination and fertilization, right? So things often fit together from week 2 and week 5, and you can explain them as a story. It's going to make more sense. You'll see with the final exam too, there'll be more from the second half, right, than there will be from the first half, but still some continuity of leaves taking sunlight, but then you understand now what photosynthesis is, and you can talk about, oh, what if there was some problem with photosynthesis? Right? You've learned in the homework that one question type that I like is, what if this structure, leaf, stem, etc., isn't working properly, right? Because then I'm counting on you to explain to me what's supposed to be happening based on your understanding. So we have the example of these plants where stomata can't close. How does it exist in this variety of environments? Different humidity level, different temperature. So I'm not going to use that same exact question, but I'm going to ask you something else that gets at, oh, there may be a different plant has some other mystery problem, and you need to use your understanding about that process or that structure to tell me, how could we deal with this? What might happen here? What's an alternative? And that does necessitate on your part some specificity, right? Like in answer to the stomata that can't close, if it's just plants won't grow as well, like that's part of the truth, but why? Is it going to be because of that humidity? Is it going to be because of some other aspect of water? What's be precise about the effect, and in doing so, indicate your understanding of that particular plant part that I'm asking about. present there, so putting those all together, right? And maybe then, right, that would be one where, like, something you could extend it to would be, we talked about, propagation, where you can remove the leaves and you could put that stick, right, with a couple nodes in the ground, and now with moisture and darkness, you could get that stem to root. How does it do that? The meristematic tissue at nodes, right? So no job yet, can become a root as needed. Kayla?
So speaking of primordia, it says, 15, where are the primordia located? I mean, I missed the whole section, what is primordia?
It's just the baby leaves.
Okay.
And so they're all folded up in there. And they're found at the node, right, in the axillary bud. And in their earliest development, they're already present. And then the next one folds over to protect, just like the root cap protects the root meristem, just like the bud scar, the bud scale, before it becomes a scar, the bud scale protects that apical bud.
That makes sense.
Right? Important stuff to protect that tissue that can become any cell type. Right? That's your stem cell. That's your response to the environment under unknown circumstances. And so hanging on to that and making sure it's usable at that moment it's called for is important. What else?
Can you go over the zone of maturation?
Absolutely. Zone of maturation connects what I said Wednesday about breaking dormancy back to what I said in week 2 about plant roots. And again, here's another story that if you can tell, right, so root cap, we just talked about protecting that root meristem. Cells dividing, it's the first method for growth. Make more cells, make those more cells bigger, right, elongate, and then, once they've elongated, next step is to assign a job. So then dermal tissue becomes root hair, for example, vascular tissue becomes xylem and phloem. Right? You take on those specific tissue types. Ground tissue in the root becomes root cortex.
So the zone of maturation is just the area where things get assigned their parts.
That's right. No longer meristematic at that point because it now has a specific role. Others?
Number 6.
Number 6. What's girdling? What does it do to the tree? Okay. Yeah, so we didn't specifically address that, but I think that talking about it would still be useful. Anybody know what that is? Girdling? It's not only for trees. You can girdle a ornamental, right, plant as well, herbaceous plant. So we're- Yeah, I mean, yeah, part of it's cutting off, you got that. Andrew?
It's when a root grows in a circular pattern around the plant, and as it thickens, chokes off the nutrient.
Interesting. Root girdling, yeah, so is what you're saying, that generally something becomes pot bound and tends to go in a circle and choke something out. This, the student who made that question, these came out of an end of the term assignment to make your own quiz and test questions, are more referring to the interior structure of the stem. So, Christopher, you were, say something about that too.
It's essentially going to be mechanical damage of some sort or another, the
around the tissue in the middle, this is your epidermis on the outside. Girdling, to what Silver was getting at, is where you cut in, so you cut in, and you don't slice it off, but you score all the way around the stem, and you remove a piece of the outside, right, the epidermis. So, in doing so here, that's gone, and that's gone. This is getting at similar territory to the question about how does the sequoia with the middle cut out for cars to drive through continue to survive. When you girdle the outside, you're removing epidermis, you're probably removing phloem, right? You're getting right to it. And what's going to happen if we remove the phloem? So before death, what's it? Cuts off the sugars moving around, right? So if this is leaf material here and trying to get to the stem, then those leaves can photosynthesize and make sugar, but they can't necessarily now send it below this point, right? So anything down here might be running out of energy. Can't grow more shoots down here without additional energy. So girdling has a potential negative effect.
Could also cut the oxen so that buds shoot out below it.
It's possible, yeah. You get some sparkler growth reaction as you're putting the plant into a state of like emergency by creating this big wound all the way around. So this is also a way that some commercial products are derived. Rubber tree, for example, is girdled to get, right, the flow of rubber, right, sap to leak out. Let's see. So you can see, not cutting down the tree, right, but going through the bark, in the case of these trees, into the vascular tissue, into the xylem. Girdling tool, oftentimes it's just done with a knife. Here's a good one.
So this is just for harvesting certain things?
Just for killing it.
Sometimes it's, you intentionally want to damage a tree, for example. It's in a dangerous location, and before you're going to take it down, you would rather cut down a dying tree with not as much water inside. So there's some cases where you're intentionally trying to harm something. Otherwise, bark stripping, peeling, girdling, pruning tool, you're just ripping right down into that, through that vascular tissue, and then in some cases it's like this is the way to get rubber, this is the way to access maple syrup, or you can tap right in a hole, just a single hole that goes to the same tissue, rather than going all the way around. So the focus here is not to understand girdling so much as it is to understand the role of the vascular tissue in the way that that giant sequoia is supported by the functional sapwood, right, very close to the bark, just beneath the bark. That's functional xylem, moving water, functional phloem, and understand that role. It's a narrow band, right, whether it's a tree or a herbaceous plant that has that functional role. If we take that away, what's the consequence?
So the consequence would be like the tree would start to die, right?
So, in this case, nothing from above, if you remove the phloem, can be moved down here. And if you remove the functional xylem, nothing from below can be moved both sides are missing something, and eventually they're gonna use the remaining supply here and the remaining supply up there, and have a problem when it's gone.
Would this ever be used to like control the size of the tree, or would that just kind of be pointless because the tree would then die?
It's a pretty damaging way to control the size.
I was like, what do you do?
You're more permanently controlling the size.
Okay.
You can use pruning, nutrition,
Okay.
other methods first. Yeah,
Would this be a way to control limb growth on one side of the tree?
Yep, definitely. You could let that one, from here, you see that thing start to die, then that's a spot where then you could make a cut. But you could also just make that cut right away, you don't have to drill first. Although I gave the example of sometimes you don't want as much mass to take down.
So 50%. Out in the woods, sometimes you'll see a whole group of limbs right at the base of the tree, and then the rest of the tree is grown up, but it's just thick brush all the way around for certain portions. So is that when there's been damage and survived it?
Yeah, trees, trees there.
How do you save a tree that has a hole in it and you don't have to use a crane and stuff?
How do you save a tree that has a hole in it? Any ideas out there? How do you save that tree that has a hole in it? Catherine?
I mean, I'm pretty sure that is not gonna be stressing me. Having this water on the trees, to be able to like, put that in, disease. But like you often don't want to. It's just what is not.
Like try to grab the branch.
I don't know what they're actually on, but it's like you want to let it create its own organs, kind of seal off. You gotta like seal it.
It's just the rain and making all
Yeah, so that way you might cover a portion, tarp or something, so that it's not raining directly into it. But generally supporting the overall plant health and allowing it to seal that off is the general strategy. No,